everyone. I'm attorney Donna Berger, and this is Take It to the Board, where we speak condo and HOA. My guest today is Andrew Fortin, the Senior Vice President of External Affairs for Associa, an international management company. Andrew oversees public affairs, media relations, and corporate citizenship efforts for Associa's clients, industry colleagues, and business partners. Prior to joining Associa, Andrew served as the Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for the Community Associations Institute. He has worked for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Club Association, which has been the advocate for the private club industry in Washington, D.C. for 60 years, and has served as the Chief of Staff and Budget Committee Liaison for a Michigan congressman. Andrew holds a Bachelor of Science in Political Science from Central Michigan University and earned his J.D. from the Catholic University of America. He is a licensed attorney in the District of Columbia and Virginia. Andrew, welcome to Take It to the Board.
Hey, Donna, it's good to be here. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, and I'm so excited that we were able to get you on. I know you're a very, very busy man. And as we sit here today and we're taping this, we've gone through Thanksgiving. Hanukkah has just ended, and we're heading into Christmas and the New Year. These are all some of my favorite holidays, Andrew. But I have to say, when it comes to decor, you and your Halloween decor is some of the best I've ever seen. Is that your favorite holiday?
Donna, you're too kind. For your listeners, I'll try to paint a quick picture. I live in a very walkable and a historic neighborhood in Dallas. My house was built in 1909, which is insane if you think that Dallas really didn't take off as a city until like the 1850s. So we live in an area that's surrounded by multifamily housing. So for Halloween, we typically get 1,000 to 1,500 trick-or-treaters. So we take Halloween seriously. We have this columned porch with a balcony over it, like kind of a demi-lune or a half-circle porch, kind of like the White House, but not as glamorous. So we drape it in fabric and we do this whole Great Pumpkin theme. The front of our house is the Great Pumpkin, and we have the Lucy, psychiatric advice booth 5 cents, and we have 5 or 6 friends over to help us hand out the candy. So it's wonderful. But as much as I like Halloween, I'm actually a huge fan of Christmas and New Year's, and I'm so glad you asked me to be part of this segment. For me, these holidays are about new beginnings and the wonderful possibilities are what to come, right? And that could be spiritual, that could be secular. You do New Year's resolutions. It's just really about taking time to set your expectations and what you want to accomplish in the year ahead. Plus, I like me a good Christmas carol, so I feel pretty lucky that you asked me to talk about these topics today.
Well, I feel like in addition to all the different things I mentioned that you've done, you also have a potential career in interior design. Again, I look at your social media feeds, and when you open up your home and what you and Sam have done, and it's a warm, fuzzy feeling. So this is, my podcast is Take It to the Board, and it's all about the space that we both operate in and have for years, which is the community association industry. What do you think in terms of the holiday season? Obviously, last year, 2020, at this time, people had very small festivities, if any. It was just much darker time. What are you seeing for this year in terms of like your associate communities? Are you seeing any new trends emerging? Are our communities once again looking to really dive into the holidays, have the big holiday gatherings?
First, I want to start off with, I think we're all tired of the pandemic, right? Unfortunately, for now, the pandemic isn't tired of us. So, I'm hopeful. And as my grandfather used to tell me, all storms run out of rain. So we will get to a better place. And I do want to throw in here too, I want to thank all the folks out there who serve on their boards in their community and the truly amazing work that they did last year to get their communities through the pandemic. They are so appreciated. And where we go in 22 is we don't know, right? We've got this new variant. But if you look at the data, the waves are getting kind of smaller. So I'm hopeful that, we'll see more opportunities to connect with each other in 2022. I know we just had at our corporate office in Dallas, we just had our holiday party for our corporate employees. And it was the first time we've gotten together as a group since March of 2020. So that was a positive change. We are, as a company, investing a lot of resources going into 2020 in programs that support community events for the communities that we manage. So I think like everything else over the past 20 months, I think it's a matter of assessing risk, right? Mm-hmm. And right now I'm pretty comfortable with any outdoor activities, right? As it gives folks a chance to spread out. You've got fresh air always circulating. And I think each community is going to have its own risk level and preferences. And, as you and I worked together last year to get advice to boards around the country on how to handle this, I think boards should continue to work with their attorneys and their local health officials to assess risk as they move forward. But we are seeing a desire in the communities we manage and even within our company of folks getting together in person in ways that are safe and smart.
I agree with you. I think, Pete, there is COVID fatigue. But here's the thing. For boards, they can't afford to get tired of this situation. Again, they have to stay focused. And as you just mentioned, work with counsel, follow public health guidance. We do have this variant out there. And I'm guessing it's probably not, Andrew, going to be the last variant we see with this thing. If you follow the news and you're following the public health guidance, we're probably looking at living with COVID in some form or another for years to come. In terms of where we are in having this conversation regarding holidays, I think the holidays take on an even heightened significance because it's a way to retain that sense of community. It's just a question now of how do we do that and manage an ongoing twisting pandemic as it takes these turns and curves.
Yeah. And, I think some of the things we've seen different communities do is, when much like a weather forecast, right? Like if it's going to rain today, take an umbrella. If the infection rate, there's a surge in your state or your community, well, then maybe you want to step back a bit or wear a mask or focus on doing stuff outside where people can spread out. That's how I think our branches are kind of gauging things. Like, okay, so if my location is seeing a surge, then, okay, let's take a step back. Let's put our masks back on. Let's focus on outdoor activities. But I think between our health officials and between us personally, I think we've started to gauge where our comfort level is with the risk that exists. And I'm certainly hoping for brighter days as we head into 2022.
Is there a potential for hypocrisy when it comes to the way boards deal with holiday situation? Let me give you an example. Let's say we're in an HOA with a beautiful large clubhouse, and in the past, owners could reserve that clubhouse for private events. So in this HOA, Mrs. Smith wants to reserve the clubhouse and have a holiday party, and the HOA says, no, can't do it because of the pandemic. Then later, the HOA is hosting a holiday party in the same clubhouse. Do we have that potential for boards not realizing that you have an issue, not just PR, but perhaps even a health issue when you're on the one hand prohibiting the owners from doing something, but then the association is sponsoring a similar event? What do you think of that?
What we strive to tell our boards is, you need to be consistent. We have seen over, the period of 2020, we've seen leaders get in trouble for that kind of stuff, right? Where there's maybe a governor will put in place limitations on public gatherings or indoor space gatherings, and then a week later be caught in a restaurant without a mask with their friends, right?
Oh, Andrew, so, I know who you're referring to, but okay.
Yeah, exactly. I happen to be in that location right now in that state. But, I think for leaders and for boards, you need to, talk the talk and walk the walk, right? Like I think most people, I know there's been a lot of, debate and a lot of sometimes confrontation about all these health measures. But, we need to take a step back and realize, it's not a 50-50 thing. You're right. 70% of the people in the United States have gotten vaccines. Most people want to do what's right by their neighbors. But if you're in a board and you're in a position of making those decisions and you're saying, okay, you guys can't do that, then I think from a PR standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, and a credibility standpoint, you need to hold yourself to that same standard. And I think that just builds or makes for a more harmonious community. We're tired. We're frustrated. We do want to get back together, but making sure that if you're setting the rules for other people, you're following those rules too.
So, Andrew, Mariah Carey, of all people, recently got in the news when she reacted to a Florida couple in an HOA. Apparently, they put up their Christmas lights before Thanksgiving, and the HOA threatened to fine them for that. And Mariah showed her support by tweeting, and I'm going to quote, she tweeted, "My personal preference is to wait until after Thanksgiving, but there's no regulating festiveness." I wonder if that owner thought the fine was worth it just to have Mariah Carey tweet about his situation. I bring that up because we have a lot of issues when it comes to what people can and cannot put out when it comes to holiday decor. And this is particularly true in homeowners associations. We've got single family homes. I live in a homeowners association, and we have pretty strict rules when it comes to holiday decor. Did you happen to catch that story with Mariah?
I did catch that story, and it's insane, right? I always advise our clients that, if the subject matter relates to holidays, kids, veterans, pets, or American flags, that they really need to tread carefully, right? Because those are all things that generate a lot of passion. And if Mariah Carey is chiming in on an issue in your community, it's probably not great PR for the board. My guiding principle here is that, rules should reflect the values and the reality in the community. In this case, from what I've read about this case, it's a lot of what similar to what goes on in my neighborhood, right? 5 or 10 years ago, most folks put up their own holiday light. Today, there are businesses that specialize in this. And that may mean, for scheduling reasons, which I think was the case here, that someone comes in and, they bring in a lift and they put the lights all over your house, and the lights go up before Thanksgiving because it's just, from a scheduling point of view or from a discount, an early bird discount, that may be the case. So, boards should take a flexible approach, right? But also I think if the community has a rule that most folks aren't following, it may be time to update that rule, because the rules are there for the residents and should reflect the values of the community. Another tool we try to use is that boards can also flip the script on this stuff. So rather than focus on when lights are put up, maybe they set up a time or an event the Friday after Thanksgiving to encourage people to turn on their holiday lights at that time, and then recognize folks or give out, prizes or, a yard sign, best holiday lights, reflecting the folks for their creativity. And maybe one of the qualifications are, the lights debut on that day, right? So if you turn your lights on before that, well, then you're not eligible for this event, but make it an event and make it a positive thing.
I always think rules should be crafted to address a problem, not just be crafted for the sake of having a rule. So when it comes to lighting and decor related to the holidays, what's the problem? Is it noise? Is it nuisance from the light? Is it debris? I'm going to give you an example of a real life situation, Andrew. I live in South Florida, and in one of the cities down here, there was a Christmas display at a home. I actually had two sets of friends that lived in this community. It was on a cul-de-sac, did not have a mandatory association. It was, I think, eight homes in this cul-de-sac, and one of the homes hosted an extreme Christmas event. Now, the name Extreme really said it all. Mm-hmm. They started setting up in early October, end of September, early October, setting up for this event. Remember, these are single family homes on a cul-de-sac, one way in, one way out. This event, they would set up in October, late September. It would run through mid-January. It attracted thousands of people into this cul-de-sac. The lights, they were lit up fairly long time. I mean, we're talking about, 11 at night, and it started, when dusk. The lights, the people, the debris, the people living in the community would talk about the fact that people coming to see the display would leave garbage. More concerning, EMTs and ambulances would have had a hard time getting into that cul-de-sac. I mean, finally, the city got involved. There was litigation. And again, this did not involve an association. But I do see the other side of this is you have to strike a balance between allowing people to express the joy that most of us feel during the holiday season. And we do that by what? Making our homes look festive, inviting family and friends into the home, but also not creating a nuisance in terms of the lighting, the noise, the debris, things like that.
I think you give a good example, right? Like, I think that the reason many communities have these rules is to address these outlier situations. Your example is an extreme example, right? But we do see shows, I think there are shows on HGTV about extreme Christmas, right? And people who do this all over the country. But there is a health and safety and sometimes a nuisance component to this. And I think that's probably where these rules came from. Not wanting to see Christmas lights up in July, right? Because nobody's taking them down and they're kind of hanging off the eve of the house and that kind of stuff, right? Looking kind of shabby. I think to get around that or to address it in a way, first of all, I agree with your statement that, rules should exist to solve problems. If there's no problem, there should be no rule. But I think boards can pass rules related to outdoor decorations. I think when they do that those rules should be ecumenical and they should focus on time, place, and manner of decorations. We live in an increasingly diverse country, and it's a lose-lose proposition. And as an attorney, likely problematic from a potential discrimination standpoint to pick and choose holidays and regulate those holidays. So I think most boards get that. And I think there's a lesson we've learned from the pandemic that then when there's a question of what the board can and cannot do, that their qualified counsel is really their partner to help them navigate this. But, if there's concerns about, like the example you set or the example I set where, I had this issue when I was trying to sell my house years ago, where my neighbor, they were wonderful people. They just had a lot going on. They had an old live Christmas tree that they brought out of their house and threw in the front yard in March. They had Christmas lights hanging off their house in March while I was trying to sell my home. I think that's where these rules come from. But, I think you can successfully navigate those by one, working with your attorney to really kind of address what your concerns are in your community that reflects your community values, and not focusing on Christmas or Hanukkah or Diwali or any of those things, but focusing on, hey, we recognize that our diverse community, people may want to decorate their house for various holidays that reflect their culture, and that's informative to us as residents. Here's some general rules to help make sure that those displays are consistent and respectful of their neighbors. And I think that's where you focus on time, place, and manner.
But Andrew, we've got to talk about, should HOAs be attempting to regulate taste? So what constitutes tasteful decorations? And I hear you chuckling, but I will tell you, I was in a community the other day, visiting a friend, walking by, and there was a home. It must have had 20 of those inflatables, and one was a dancing hula Santa Claus. So he was wearing a grass skirt and he was, doing the hula. And it was a mishmash of different, designs. It was everything. It was the minions with the dancing hula Santa, with an 8-foot inflatable Frosty. It was a lot. But is it your HOA's job to regulate taste?
I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? I think the example you gave, I think everybody who's listening to this knows of a house in their community that does that, right? That has 100 of those inflatable holiday decorations. And yeah, for me, it's a bit busy and much. But, I don't think you get into regulating taste, right? I think you get into, hey, let's focus on time, place, and manner. Let's give people the freedom to celebrate these in a way that doesn't impinge or infringe on their neighbors' quiet enjoyment of their property. Just because I might not agree with someone's aesthetic choices of including minions, Bumbles, the abominable snowman from Rudolph, and all these other things, in the same display, doesn't mean it's not going to add to my holiday joy. And, so I think, focusing on ways that people can express their individuality, but have time, place, and manner restrictions in place, so we make sure that we respect the rights of the people around them, I think is the best way to approach it. And there's no perfect way to approach it. But for me and my 20 years of experience, that's probably the best way to approach it.
I agree. I tend to add to your time, place, and manner. I tend to add also size limitations and number of decorations. So it doesn't matter. You could have a minion, but maybe you don't want 15 minions. So in some of my communities, we actually limit the number of different pieces of decor that you can put out. So that may be 10. It could, it depends on the size of the lots. Andrew, if we're dealing with acre lots, it's going to be different, obviously, than 0 lot line homes. But I think if you want to kind of avoid that situation where it looks like you've stumbled into an actual event space, that maybe you limit the size and the number of decorations that can be put out.
I think that's a great qualification. And I think it really speaks to what I said earlier, right? That these rules should reflect the values of the community. We too often get caught up in HOAs as being prescriptive, but really they're the most local unit of governance that there is, right? It's neighbors governing neighbors. So, with all the factors you said, if it's 0 lot line homes, maybe there's a set of rules to deal with that because there's not enough yard space. If it's ranchettes that are on an acre or 2 acre homes, then it's a little different. And that's what's great about our industry, right? Is that each of these communities can work with their board to set those rules. And I think that's an important element of this discussion.
Since you've mentioned, I think once or twice during this podcast that we're both attorneys, let's geek out a little bit here as attorneys and talk about freedom of speech, because this comes up a lot. This has come up over the last couple of years with some of my communities, some of my HOAs that have no sign rules. They don't like signs. They don't want the for sale signs. They don't want the contractor signs. But we've seen holiday decor now that Keep Christ and Christmas sign. A lot of my people living in communities have put those out. Then we've got like the Happy Hanukkah signs. If they want to enforce it, my recommendation has been, hey, carve out an exclusion for signage that's only up temporarily and it's related to a holiday, part of a holiday decor. But let's say we've got a community that says, no, we don't want any signs. And your holiday sign is a sign and we have a no sign rule. And then, of course, the owner comes back and says, you are infringing on my right to freedom of speech. This is my form of speech.
That is a really great question. And absent having a semester-long class on the Constitution, which I would love to have, right? Like, let's get a bottle of wine and let's sit down and talk about this stuff. But I'll share how I approach this. First, as you know, as an attorney, freedom of speech applies to the government's ability to limit or control what a person or an organization says or whom they meet with or how they express themselves. This does not generally apply to private non-governmental actors, and community associations have generally been treated by the courts as private actors, right? Mm-hmm. But, I don't want that to be the only way we define this. Another more positive way to look at this is that our Constitution, or this bundle of rights that we have as Americans, also provides us with the right to make agreements with our neighbors. In fact, that's a really sacred right in the United States, right? So we have the right to make agreements with each other, and the law is going to respect that. And that's a very concise way for me to encapsulate living in an HOA or condo. You enter into this contract about how your community will operate, how we'll work together to develop rules and have input into that process. I think it's a bad policy for the board in general to ban things outright, like, holiday decorations. But again, that's where it gets to the rules. I think the way to get around that is to focus on time, place, manner, size, duration, that kind of stuff. And it goes back to the statement I made earlier. There's areas where we need to be sensitive because they're cultural touch points for us as Americans. And that's holidays or religious displays, the American flag, people, veterans who might put stuff in their yard, pets, children. Those are all hot button issues. And I think when I have clients that fall into that or having issues with that, let's say there's a rule in a community that says you can't put ornamentation over a certain size, and there's a veteran who puts a stone that commemorates a service in World War II, that's going to generate attention. That's going to generate negative attention, and you want to find ways to work through those issues, especially in those categories I just mentioned. I think HOAs have the ability to make those rules. I think that's supported generally in the case law that I've been exposed to. But I think you need to be sensitive to what's important to people. And as a board member, remembering that, part of that is serving the wants and the culture of the community you represent.
That's such a great segue, Andrew, into what I wanted to talk about in terms of associations being sensitive to the fact that we have people celebrating different holidays. I actually have some rules in older HOAs where they only refer to Christmas and Easter. They're not looking at non-Christian holidays. They're not looking at holidays, not even the ones that we would think of. For instance, the Jewish holiday of Sukkah comes up a lot down here in Florida. And that is a holiday that is in the spring, and that involves creating a hut, constructing a hut outside your residence. And in a lot of our HOAs, that's highly regulated. You can't install things. That's considered an architectural modification that requires board approval. How do we get our boards to become more sensitive to the diversity that's all around us, particularly when it comes to holidays?
We have, I think 18,000 communities across North America under management, and that extends from Canada to Mexico. So we see celebrations and decorations going up for Day of the Dead, or All Saints Day celebrations. We see Diwali celebrations. We see all these things. And I think for me, and I think the lesson I hope that most of our boards learn from the pandemic is when you're trying to find the way to do what's right and make sure that you meet your obligations in your role as a fiduciary for the community, plus the need to be culturally respective of the diversity in your community, is to work with your attorney. I noted before that community values change over time, and as new folks move into a community, traditions or businesses practices can change. Boards can stay ahead of this, I think, and what we try to do is encourage our boards to do a rule audit every year or every couple of years and do surveys. Hey, what's important to you guys? Where should we be focusing our attention? I think that's the way I think to handle it, is understanding that, there's a saying, rules are written in stone. Well, rules aren't written in stone. They can change, whether it's a federal law or a state law or a community association rule. They're democracies. They respond to the will and the desires and the values of the people who live there. So stay on top of it. Find out what's important to your communities. Work with your attorney to develop things that are fair to everyone that lives there. I think that's how I'd approach it.
Rules can and should change. I agree 100% with your idea of a rules audit. If your board hasn't looked at your rules in the last 2 to 3 years and sat and said, is this still needed? I mean, I had one community, Andrew, I said this on a previous episode. They had a 22-page rule book, 22 pages. And when we actually went through it, much of those rules were no longer needed. But to what we've been talking about, so many of these different holidays, Dia de los Muertos, for instance, these are beautiful traditions. And I think everybody benefits from being exposed to that. So, Andrew, how did you decide to make your career in the community association industry?
Wow, that's a good question. I think for a lot of us, we sort of fell into it. I like to tell people, when I share what I do for a living, I like to tell people that the community association industry is the biggest industry that people have never heard of. For almost 1 in 4 people in the United States live in a homeowners association of some point, whether it's condo or an HOA. I fell into the industry, but I feel lucky that I did. My background is government affairs and public relations, and I spent most of my career in Washington, D.C. And in 2006, I was looking for a new job. I was working as a professional, as you said in my bio, I was a lobbyist for the private club industry. And that was really interesting because private clubs deal with a lot of constitutional issues that we were just talking about if how big can a group be and still determine who they hang out with, right? How much do we value freedom versus equality? And that's a whole interesting area. You see that with all male clubs or all female clubs and the debate that generates. But I like to say I went from the clubhouse to the gatehouse. And in 2006, I was hired by the Community Associations Institute as their VP of Government Affairs. And I got to know you and other attorneys. I was the executive director of the College of Community Association Lawyers. And my first year in the industry, I was like, what have I gotten myself into? What the heck is going on? But, at some point it clicked for me. There are so many great people in this business. And I'm in awe of our board members and how they volunteer their time to make their communities better. So if there's anything I can use from my experience or my expertise or my training or my licenses that supports them, that brings me a lot of joy. And that's why I feel lucky that I get to do what I do. There's also amazing professionals like you and, accountants and landscape people, all these folks who serve these communities. That for me, having spent a good part of my career in DC, I'm very passionate, very patriotic. That's what America is. A community is made up of all these people working together to accomplish a common goal. And I'm just so fortunate to be part of that with a very dynamic and a very innovative company. I couldn't ask for a better career path at this point.
I think one of my biggest fears, Andrew, for our industry is at some point, are people going to no longer be willing to volunteer to serve on these boards? Is it going to become so complicated and so fraught with the potential for liability that it doesn't make sense anymore?
I think we're in a time right now where that's a really valid question. We've seen, it surprised me over the last 20 months to see what people are getting upset about. Plus, on top of that, we don't have good examples from our leadership, right? From our state government or from our federal government. We don't have leaders that are valuing and putting in the forefront. We can disagree and not be disagreeable. And we're starting to see that trickle into our boards as well. I think what we need to do is remind ourselves, right, that the board is here to make decisions, on landscaping and how we can enjoy our community. These aren't, with the exception maybe of weird things like the pandemic, necessarily life or death decisions. And we need to make sure that we empower these volunteers with the skill set of making those decisions, especially since right now it seems that everything that's valued right now that we see on TV or with politicians is divisiveness and controversy. But there is so much joy, and it's not hard to flip that into collaboration and finding common ground. It just takes more work. They say that democracy is the worst system, save all others, right? Yeah. It's hard. You have to work at it. You have to get to know your neighbors. You have to, if not agree with someone, maybe respect at least where they're coming from. I think we need to double down and make sure that we, as leaders in the industry and boards as leaders in their community, demonstrate that behavior. We're not always going to agree. It doesn't mean we have to be enemies.
I'm going to come back at you with a quote too. Voltaire said, "You get the government you deserve." So if you live in a community association, run for the board or vote. At the very least, a lot of these communities don't have elections. Boards just roll over year to year because nobody's actually participating. But Andrew, you and I met because of your work in the legislation. And that's how I came into your sphere. I was impressed with the work you do in that space. How do you educate our public policy makers about the community association lifestyle when I will tell you many of them have never lived in a condo or an HOA? I used to testify in front of the Florida legislature, and sometimes I would ask that question, could you raise your hands if you've ever lived in an HOA or a condo? And very few hands went up. So how do you educate them about what it really means to serve on the board and how these communities operate?
Well, first, I want to go back to what you said before. You said, encouraging folks to serve on your board. I have the saying all the time, living in a community association is not a spectator sport. You have the opportunity to make decisions that are going to help preserve or protect or enhance the value of your home and your community. That's a great thing. I live in a neighborhood that was built in 1909, so I don't live in an HOA, unfortunately, but I have the same rules because I live in a historic district. And I have to just go through the city rather than go through my neighbors. And that makes it even harder. But I'm engaged in that process. We have a neighborhood committee. What are the things that are important to us that we need to communicate to the city? I think that same thing is true with the legislative process. Having been a congressional staffer and then a lobbyist for 25 years of my career, I can tell you that elected representatives do listen to voters, but they listen to the voters that they hear from. Let me say that again. They listen to the voters that they hear from. So if the only people they hear from are people who are unhappy, the person who lives down the street from you who doesn't believe in HOAs and doesn't believe that they have to pay their fair share to help maintain the common areas of your community, they hear from that person, yeah, they're going to have a distorted view. So, it's important, I think, for folks to know and communicate with their state elected representative and their federal representatives. But for our industry, most of what we deal with is governed by state law. Invite, if you're having a summer barbecue, a summer, 4th of July event, or another thing a lot of communities do is National Night Out. We're a national sponsor of National Night Out. That brings law enforcement and communities together to build a dialogue, right? That's important right now. Invite your state representative or your state senator to come see your community and see how it operates. Because you and I both know too, that study after study shows that, 80-90% of people who live in HOAs approve of the job their board is doing.
There's a reason they call them the silent majority. Because they're basically happy. They're going about their life and they're okay with the way their community is being run. But to your point, so true. They're hearing, a lot of our legislators are hearing from a very small minority of people, but that's who they're hearing from. They're not hearing from the silent majority. I always used to say, Andrew, contact your legislators, but do it when they're in their home, in their district offices, not when they're in session. I realize some states have year-round legislatures. Down here in Florida, it's only 60 days. The rest of the year is when they're more available for communities to do outreach and invite them in or go to the district offices and meet with their legislators.
You bring up a couple good points, and I want to expand on those briefly. I worked as an industry lobbyist for years, so that was my profession, is to go, oh, hey, you're thinking about doing this. This could be the good parts of that. This could be the bad parts, and they do listen to that. There is some respect for that, right? It's about your credibility and your knowledge base, but who they really love hearing from are their direct constituents, especially folks like board members. Those are the most effective messengers that can be out there. And if you think about how you make decisions, how one makes decisions, if you have an important decision to make that might impact your career or your house or something, do you go and ask advice to someone that you've known for years, who've communicated with you, who you know, and who you've broken bread with? Or do you listen to the person that you've never met before, who suddenly shows up on your doorstep and is shouting or yelling at you to go in this direction? This is about all of what we're talking about today is about relationships. Boards making sure that they're connected with their residents and making sure that the rules and what they're doing reflects the values of the community. Boards being connected and residents being connected with their legislatures who represent them, so that they can get a full picture of all the good and bad that goes on in community associations. And when we build those relationships and we get to know these people, whether it's our board, our residents, our state legislators, that helps remove some of this divisiveness. And some of this, if you don't agree with me on everything, you're my enemy, that kind of pervades society right now. So that would be my advice, right? Invite your state rep to a community event, invite them to an annual meeting, especially if it doesn't have a lot of contentious, maybe not one that has a special assessment. But if they see how this stuff is working, I think they're better informed to make decisions. And to be fair to an elected official, they have to be experts on everything, which they can't be.
Right.
So they're going to rely on people they hear from to help make those decisions. The more connected people are in the decision-making of their community, in the governance of their community, the more they understand the why behind that, I think the more that people are able to engage in debate and find common solutions. And that in turn shapes how people perceive not only your community, but our industry. So those are my words of advice as we
wise words they are.
Yeah, as we wipe the slate clean and start the new year, right? Like I talked about, what I like about this time of year is I'm thinking about, okay, this year, here's what I learned, here's what I accomplished, what I didn't accomplish, and what did I learn from that I can apply to next year and what my hopes and dreams are.
You've been in the community association industry for more than just a minute. You've built an incredible reputation. People look to you as an expert. What are you seeing in terms of legislation? Are we going to be looking, do you think, Andrew, at more government oversight of boards, more regulation of boards, or less?
Our industry is still fairly young. The HOA industry and condo industry really kind of started to emerge about 40 plus years ago. And, they weren't as prevalent back then as they are now. Now, most of the new units that are getting built in the United States are in an HOA or a condo for various reasons, right? So I think more regulation is to be expected. But I think the issue here is, will we get regulations that will help us, or regulations that will be more of a reaction to a small group of loud voices? And I think I'm going to reference what we just talked about, right? Is how we ensure that we get to a place that those regulations help our boards and help our communities achieve their dreams and their goals, is to make sure that we've built those relationships we have that engagement so that we can inform that process in an intelligent way. I think and federal and state officials are going to be better listeners to our boards when they're engaged and they have built those relationships. And I think when that happens, we're going to get the outcomes that benefit rather than burden our communities. And that takes time, right? That takes time to build that up. I think the challenge a lot of boards have, and I think you mentioned earlier, and this isn't just limited to our industry. You see it at the state government level, you see it at the federal government level. If I'm running for the board and I'm saying, hey, the structure of our building it's getting kind of old, we need to do some maintenance to keep it safe. So please elect me. I'll make sure that we put in place a special assessment to pay for these repairs. And I'm running against a person who's like, oh, everything's fine. In fact, if you elect me, I'm going to lower our condo assessments. And then they vote for the other guy, right? That happens at state government. That happens at federal government. I'm going to lower your taxes. I'm going to do this. I think most people don't buy that, but I think people need to be smart voters, smart consumers, smart participants in their community. I think if we do that and we're engaged with our regulators, I think we will get to a place where that regulation is appropriate and only touches on the areas that need to be touched on. And I think we get there by making sure that the voices of that silent majority are heard just as well as the voices of the folks who might not have read the documents and don't agree to abide by the rules in the community that they signed a document saying that they would.
You've touched on the voices that are really anti-HOA, perhaps anti-board. If that segment ever got their wish and HOAs were abolished, would cities take these communities back? I always look at this, Andrew, as, my God, these millions of HOAs and millions of associations throughout the country, the amount of burden that they've taken off cities because they are handling all the regulation. They're doing all the enforcement. These folks don't have to go to the city code enforcement because they have, a car on stocks next door. They are the ones maintaining the roads and maintaining the landscaping. If that small segment that says, you know what, really HOAs shouldn't exist, we don't trust them, we don't want them, would cities even take these communities back? Would they be willing to step in?
Well, I think the answer to that is no, because they couldn't afford to. It's CAI, the Community Associations Institute, which is our professional trade group, a group I used to work with. They come out with a survey. They have a foundation that comes out with a survey every year, and they quantify the value of the time that these volunteer board members, there's hundreds of thousands of people who volunteer their time to govern their communities and make these decisions that otherwise would be on the government. And people in a master plan community pay assessments to maintain park space in that community. That helps keep our taxes low. That helps keep the size of government low. And I think our volunteers and the people who live in these communities do it in a way that's so much more efficient than if we were to have nothing against this, right? Because I know there's folks in the government, state and federal government who work very hard, but it's a much more efficient way to address these issues. And I think it's a much more efficacious way of doing this. If you look at the survey data of how people approve of their community governance versus the number of people who approve of state and federal government, I think there's evidence to support that hypothesis.
And you can't legislate, I say this to clients, Andrew, you can't legislate good behavior. You can't legislate sensitivity training. Some of this these are problems that we as a society just have to work through and hopefully do better on a going forward basis. I think I'm safe in saying Associa is the largest management company in the world.
You are. I will support that statement. Yes, we are.
Okay. So then you're the perfect person to ask. Some states regulate the management industry. Florida still does, but there's been talk down here over the last couple of years about potentially deregulating the management industry in Florida. How do you feel about deregulating the management industry?
I think all boards should look for and hire qualified community association managers. And I will tell you how to do that in a second. From a standpoint of regulation, I do think that the pendulum has swung from more regulation or licensing of managers in our profession. And I think we've probably, at least for the next couple of years, hit peak licensing for community managers. But let me tell you what I see as a really good model for states. And as a Texan, I may get in trouble for saying this, but what you see in California is really a good template. In California, they have a law that encourages community managers to attain industry designations. There's different industry groups that offer them, and they're There's CAI's Professional Community Association Manager, which is like a PhD in community management. And there's the Community Association Managers, CACM here in California as well. What they have in California is they have a law that says if you have a professional designation, then you can hold yourself out as a professional community association manager. I think that's a nice approach. And what it does is it incentivizes managers to go invest money in that training and that education. And it provides a mechanism to discipline them, because if you have that designation, much like you and I have, we're members of a bar, if we do something beyond the scope of our ethical obligations, we can lose our ability to do our jobs, right? And the same is true for these industry designations. So I think that's a nice approach to it, where there's a incentive for the boards or for the manager to get that education and training, and a reward, if you will, for how they market themselves in the market.
In an ideal world, a board of directors would understand what that investment in a manager's career meant, and that meant they received additional training and therefore may have additional expertise. But as we know in our industry, management services, legal services, they've all been so highly commoditized that often the board just says, who's lowest? What's the lowest per door price? And that's who we're going with. Are you confident that boards really appreciate the significance of obtaining those additional credentials?
I think so. I think most people are. And I think, it goes to the admonition of you're going to get what you pay for. You talked about the commoditization of, we saw this with the pandemic. Everybody has access to Google. So now everyone's an epidemiologist, everyone's a lawyer, everyone's accountant. But the truth is they're not. There was a celebrity who got in trouble for not being vaccinated recently, who said, well, I did 500 pages of research. It's like, okay, well, you laugh because, that's 3 days reading in law school. So I think, first of all, boards and people have to be willing to pay for expertise. And you have to, if I have a health issue, I'm not going to go to a podcast or a website to make that diagnosis. I'm going to go to my doctor. People have to understand that there's a cost to this, and you need to do that. And I think licensing laws don't necessarily accomplish that. They might make sure people have a base level of knowledge, but they also restrict the number of people who can come into that space. So what we've seen in places where that has existed is that the number of managers shrinks, the cost goes up, but the quality doesn't necessarily improve because it's just a base level of education, as opposed to valuing folks who have invested in continuing education and continuing advancement in these designations that signify or demonstrate their expertise.
Well, Andrew, I've kept you very long because it's been amazing to tap into that brain of yours. I have one final question. If you could pass just one law to help all types of community associations, what would it be?
Wow. That's like, if you had one wish, my first thought here isn't that we need to pass a law, I think, but rather pleading with our elected officials, and the example they set for others. I talked about this earlier. We live in a very partisan time, and examples of discourse that we get from our elected officials, for the large part, is embarrassing. So for the last few years, that seems to have trickled down to our community meetings, to how we value our boards, how we value expertise, as we were just talking about. We've lost that ability to disagree without being disagreeable. So not everything is a zero-sum debate. And I think we need to work to make sure that our boards and clients are equipped to lead by example, to respond appropriately to bullies, to make decisions and invest the money to get the expertise they need, and get away from this my way or highway type of approach to everything.
So that's going to boil down to who we elect to be our leaders. But I agree with you. Andrew, this has been a pleasure. Happy holidays to you and Sam. Safe and healthy holidays. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Leave a review so more people can take it to the board. And visit takeittotheboard.com for more information.